The crack of the wagon wheel split the frozen air like a rifle shot. Silas Garrett felt the jolt travel up through the seat, then the sickening lurch as the hub shattered and iron rim kissed dirt. He tried to brace himself, but his 68-year-old bones had other ideas. The ground met his shoulder hard, and the cold bit through his coat in seconds. Wind howled through the pines. His breath came in white clouds that disappeared too fast. Blood from his scraped palms melted small holes in the snow, and he could smell the rust from the broken wheel hub, sharp and metallic against the pine resin in the air. Then he heard footsteps, small ones. 3 children emerged from the tree line like ghosts. The oldest, a girl maybe 11, with red-brown braids, carried a battered toolbox. Even through the gathering dark, Silas could see letters carved into the handle. TD. She knelt beside the wheel without a word. Her bare hands touched the frozen iron, and she didn't flinch. "Your daddy teach you that?" Silas managed. "He taught me everything," she said, before the fire took him. 20 minutes later, the wheel turned true. Silas invited them home for a hot meal. The children hesitated. Hunger won. Next dawn, a covered wagon rolled up the ranch drive. A man in a fine coat stepped down, holding rolled papers. Vernon Huxley smiled like winter itself. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Cora Dalton stood at the stove, flipping flapjacks, while May set the table with careful hands and Jessie fed the chickens through the back door. Morning light slanted through the window, catching dust motes that hung in the warm air like tiny stars. Silas watched from his chair, and the hunger in his eyes had nothing to do with food. "You don't have to earn your keep," he said quietly. "I invited you for a meal, not a job interview." Cora didn't turn from the stove. "Mama always said idle hands are the devil's workshop. Besides, you saved us from freezing. Least we can do is make breakfast." May poured coffee into 3 tin cups, 1 for Silas, 2 for her and Cora. Jessie got milk. The boy hummed while he worked, a tuneless sound that filled the spaces between the crackle of the fire and the sizzle of bacon grease. "How long were you 3 living in that line shack?" Silas asked. 6 weeks, Cora said. She slid flapjacks onto plates. "Since the county said we were too old for the orphan trainees, but too young to claim Daddy's shop." "Your father was a blacksmith?" "Best in 3 territories." May's voice carried pride despite her 8 years. "Made everything from horseshoes to church bells." Silas reached for his coffee, and his hand trembled slightly. The liquid was hot enough to burn, but he welcomed it. "What happened to him?" "Fire," Cora said. The word dropped like a stone into still water. "Shop burned. Daddy went back in for his tools. Roof came down." Jessie stopped humming. Silas set his cup down carefully. The ceramic clinked against the table, too loud in the sudden quiet. "I'm sorry. A man's tools are his legacy." "We got his toolbox out," Cora said. She met his eyes for the first time that morning. The one with his mark on it, TD, Thomas Dalton. He carved that sunburst into everything he made. Something shifted in Silas's face. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked like a man trying to swallow words that wanted to climb out on their own. "Tom Dalton," he said finally. "From Missouri originally?" Cora nodded, wary. "Your daddy saved my life once." Silas's voice had gone rough. "Winter of '67. I was hauling supplies through a blizzard, got thrown from my horse, broke my leg. Would have frozen if a young blacksmith hadn't pulled me into his shop and set the bone. Never forgot that. Never forgot his name, neither." May's eyes went wide. "You knew our daddy?" "Not well, but well enough to owe him." Silas stood slowly, joints protesting. "Which means I owe you 3. This ranch is too big for one old man anyway. And—" The sound of wagon wheels on gravel cut him short. They all turned toward the window. Through the wavy glass, Cora could see a covered wagon pulling up to the porch. The horses were matched bays, expensive. The wagon canvas was clean and new. A man stepped down. He wore a wool coat that probably cost more than everything Cora owned, and his boots had been polished recently enough that they caught the morning sun. He was maybe 50, with graying hair and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Uncle Silas," the man called out, voice carrying through the door. "We need to talk." Silas's face went hard. "Vernon." Cora heard the weight in that single word, family obligation mixed with something that tasted like old resentment. Silas moved toward the door, shoulders set like a man preparing for a fight he didn't want. Vernon Huxley stepped onto the porch without waiting for an invitation. He had papers rolled under one arm, and when he saw the children through the doorway, his smile widened. "I see you've taken in strays," Vernon said. His tone was light, conversational. How charitable of you. Their guess, Silas said, and it's none of your concern. Actually, Uncle, it is my concern. As your only living relative, I have a responsibility to ensure you're not being taken advantage of. Vernon's gaze swept over the children like they were livestock at auction. 3 orphans show up out of nowhere, and suddenly you're playing father? At your age? With your declining faculties? My faculties are fine. Are they? Vernon unrolled the papers. Cora could see official seals, dense text, signatures. Because I've filed a petition with Judge Hayes. Guardianship review. The county wants to ensure you're competent to manage your affairs, including who you allow onto your property. Silas's hand found the doorframe, gripping it. You had no right. I had every right. Family looks after family. Vernon's eyes flicked past Silas to the children. The review begins in 90 days. Until then, I suggest you be very careful about who you trust. He turned to leave, then paused. His gaze landed on the hall table just inside the door, where a worn leather ledger sat among the morning mail. Where's your will kept these days, Uncle Silas? Vernon asked. His smile was winter itself. The church steps smelled of fresh whitewash and Sunday judgment. Cora stood between May and Jessie, their boots scraping against wood worn smooth by decades of faithful feet. The brass bell overhead had finished ringing, but its echo still hung in the cold March air. Vernon Huxley worked the crowd like a shepherd tending sheep. Tragic, really, he was saying to Mrs. Pruitt, the general store owner. His voice carried just far enough to ensure the children heard. 3 orphans appear out of nowhere, and my uncle, bless his heart, can't see past their sob story. At his age, the mind starts playing tricks. Mrs. Pruitt's daughter, Mary, had been playing jacks with May just last Sunday. Now the woman pulled the girl close, steering her away from the Dalton children like they carried plague. I heard they've been living in that old line shack, Mrs. Pruitt said. Her whisper was the kind meant to be overheard. Squatters, essentially. Exactly my concern. Vernon adjusted his coat collar against the wind. Orphans learn to be resourceful. Sometimes too resourceful, if you understand my meaning. Doc Brennan emerged from the church, hymnal tucked under his arm. Silas extended his hand for the usual Sunday greeting. The doctor looked at it, looked at Silas's face, then walked past without a word. Silas's hand hung in empty air for a moment before he lowered it. Cora felt May's fingers slip into hers, small and cold. Jessie pressed against her other side, his face buried in her coat. The boy had stopped humming 2 days ago, and she didn't know how to bring the sound back. Come on, Cora whispered. Let's go home. But Reverend Moss stood in the church doorway, watching. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes followed Vernon's movements with the careful attention of a man taking measurements. The ride back to the ranch was silent except for the wagon wheels in the wind through the pines. Silas kept his jaw tight, his hands steady on the reins. But Cora noticed how his knuckles had gone white. He's lying, May said suddenly. We're not scam artists. I know, Silas said. Then why doesn't anyone else know? Silas had no answer for that. The county assessor's office smelled of ink and leather and old paper. Judge Hayes sat behind a desk piled with ledgers and legal documents, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He was a stern man with gray whiskers and eyes that had seen enough courtroom lies to fill a cemetery. Vernon stood before him, papers spread across the desk like cards in a winning hand. Silas stood beside Cora, his breathing too shallow. She could hear it, the quick, tight pulls of air that spoke of fear poorly hidden. This is highly irregular, Judge Hayes said. He held up a typed document, official county seal pressed into the bottom. A second will, dated February 10th, 2 weeks after you claim your uncle invited these children into his home. Not claimed, Vernon said smoothly. Documented. I have witness statements from 3 townspeople who saw the children working in Uncle Silas's kitchen that very morning. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Silas leaned forward. That will is a forgery. My real will is in my ranch ledger. Handwritten, dated 5 years ago. A ledger. Vernon's tone made it sound like Silas had said napkin. Handwritten, by a man whose faculties you yourself just questioned during the guardianship review. Judge Hayes removed his glasses, cleaning them with a handkerchief. The gesture bought him time to think. Mr. Garrett, do you have this ledger will with you? It's at the ranch. And this typed will, the judge said to Vernon, you're claiming was executed when? February 10th, in my presence and that of County Clerk Morrison. Uncle Silas was having a lucid day. He expressed concern about being manipulated by strangers and wanted to ensure his estate went to family. The judge's eyes narrowed. Clerk Morrison witnessed this? He did. His signature is right there. Cora watched the judge examine the signature line. She couldn't read his expression, but something in the way his jaw tightened made her chest go hollow. This presents a problem, Judge Hayes said finally. 2 wills, both claiming legitimacy. Until I can verify which is genuine, I'm freezing all assets associated with the Garrett Ranch. No sales, no transfers, no significant expenditures, 30-day verification period starting today. Your Honor, Silas started, my ruling stands. The judge's gavel came down once, sharp as a gunshot. The county clerk stepped forward with an ink pad and stamp. He pressed the seal onto the judge's order, and Cora watched the ink bleed across the paper, black and final and merciless. Beneath it, barely visible, lay Silas's handwritten will on ledger paper, the words swimming under the official stamp like drowning men. Vernon collected his documents with careful hands. As he passed Cora on his way to the door, he leaned close enough that she could smell bay rum and something underneath it, something sour, like fear masked with cologne. 90 days, he whispered, counting down. The blacksmith yard rang with the sound of hammer on anvil. Esther Tompkins worked the forge with practiced efficiency, her leather apron darkened by years of coal smoke and sweat. The smell of hot metal filled the air, sharp and clean compared to the sour fear that had clung to the courthouse. Cora carried her father's toolbox across the threshold. May and Jessie hung back by the door, uncertain. Esther looked up from the horseshoe she was shaping. Her face was weathered like old leather, lined by 45 years of hard living, but her eyes were kind. She set down her hammer and wiped her hands on a rag. "That's Tom Dalton's toolbox," she said. Not a question. Cora nodded. "You knew my father?" "Knew him, child. I learned half my trade watching Tom work. He could coax metal into shapes most smiths wouldn't attempt." Esther gestured toward the workbench. "Set it down. Let me see." Cora placed the box on the scarred wood. Her hands left marks in the dust, small prints next to decades of larger ones. Esther opened the lid with reverent care, like she was handling something sacred. The tools inside were well used, but maintained. Hammers of different weights, tongs with jaws shaped for specific purposes, a set of punches Tom had forged himself, and on each handle, burned deep into the wood or stamped into the metal, was the same mark, a sunburst with the initials TD at its center. Esther picked up a hammer, turning it in the light from the forge. Her thumb traced the sunburst mark. "Tom burned this mark into everything he made," she said quietly. "Said it was his promise, that the sun would rise on his work tomorrow same as it did today, quality that lasted." She looked at Cora. "You're his daughter, the oldest?" "Yes, ma'am." "Cora. These are my sisters May and Jessie." "Brother," Jessie corrected from the doorway. His voice was small but firm. Esther's lips quirked. "My apologies, young man." She set down the hammer and picked up another tool, then another, examining each mark. "Your daddy's work is all over this territory. Church bell in Millbrook? Tom cast that. Iron railings at the courthouse? Tom forged those. Half the wagon wheels between here and Cheyenne have hubs he made." She paused, her hand hovering over a particular chisel, "including the wheel you 3 fixed for Silas Garrett." Cora's breath caught. "How did you know about that?" "Because I examined that wheel 2 days ago when Silas brought his wagon in for axle grease. The hub repair was clean work, better than clean, professional, and it had Tom's signature all over it." Esther met Cora's eyes. "Literally, that hub has his maker's mark stamped into the sun, TD Sunburst. I'd bet my forge on it." May stepped closer, hope flickering across her face. "You mean people can tell Daddy made it?" "People who know what to look for, yes. Tom's mark isn't just decoration, it's proof. Blacksmiths sign their work so customers know who to trust, who to come back to." Esther closed the toolbox gently. "Your father was the finest smith in 3 territories. His mark meant something, still does." Cora's mind raced. Proof. Physical proof that her father had existed, had mattered, had left something behind besides 3 orphaned children and a burned shop. "Would you testify to that?" she asked. "If someone needed proof that we're Tom Dalton's children?" Esther studied her for a long moment. The forge hissed and popped behind them, and somewhere outside a dog barked twice before falling silent. Vernon Huxley's trying to take the ranch, Esther said. It wasn't a question. He's saying we're con artists, that we tricked Mr. Garrett. And you think Tom's mark on that wheel might prove otherwise? I think, Cora said carefully, that if people remember my father, they might believe we're not liars. Esther pulled off her work gloves and tossed them onto the bench. Your daddy saved my life once. Not dramatic-like, not pulling me from a burning building. But I was a widow with no trade and 2 children to feed, and Tom taught me smithing when most men would have laughed me out of their shop. She touched the toolbox one more time. If you need me to testify, child, I'll testify. Tom Dalton's daughter isn't a liar, and I'll say so to anyone who will listen. Relief flooded through Cora so suddenly her knees went weak. May made a small sound, half laugh, half sob. Thank you, Cora whispered. Don't thank me yet. Vernon Huxley's got money and connections. Judge Hayes is fair, but he's also careful. He won't take my word alone. Esther walked to the forge, banking the coals for the night. You'll need more than sentiment. You'll need evidence that holds up in court. Reverend Moss's study smelled of old books and pipe tobacco. Silas sat in the leather chair by the window, his hands folded in his lap like a man at prayer. Cora stood beside him, while May and Jessie examined the bookshelves with the careful reverence children show in places that demand quiet. The Reverend poured tea from a chipped pot, the steam rising in lazy spirals. He was 62, with silver hair and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades listening to confessions. I've been asking questions, he said without preamble. Discreet questions, about Vernon Huxley's finances. Silas looked up. And? He owes money, quite a lot of it. $1,200 to railroad bosses in Cheyenne. Gambling debts. Reverend Moss set down the teapot. He's been borrowing against your ranch for 2 years, Silas, using your good name as collateral without your knowledge. The color drained from Silas's face. How is that possible? County Clerk Morrison. He's been filing false documents, showing Vernon as your financial proxy. I have a ledger that proves it, dates, amounts, signatures. The Reverend pulled a small book from his desk drawer. Morrison's been taking a cut, 10% of every loan. Cora leaned forward. That's fraud. It is. And it gives us Vernon's motive. He doesn't just want your ranch, Silas. He needs it. If he can't sell it to cover those debts, the railroad bosses will come collecting, and they're not known for their patience. Silas's hands trembled on the armrests. Can you testify to this? At the hearing? I can. I will. Reverend Moss met Cora's eyes. But we need more than my word against Vernon's lawyers. We need physical proof, documents, witnesses, something that can't be dismissed as hearsay. The wheel, Cora said. Esther says my father's mark is on the hub. That proves we're Tom Dalton's children. And if Mr. Garrett can testify that our father saved his life, then Vernon's story falls apart, the Reverend finished. The timeline makes sense. Tom saves Silas. Tom dies. Tom's children need help. Silas provides it. No conspiracy, just a debt being paid. Hope kindled in Silas's expression for the first time since they'd left the courthouse. Reverend Moss closed the ledger. The hearing's in 10 days. That gives us time to gather evidence, prepare witnesses. He paused. But Cora, child, you need to understand something. Vernon's desperate. Desperate men do dangerous things. The barn smelled of hay and horse sweat and something else. Fear, maybe, or the metallic tang of fate turning. Vernon Huxley stood in the center aisle, hands clasped behind his back like a man surveying property already his. Behind him, an auctioneer in a checked suit examined the cattle through the fence rails, scratching figures into a notebook. Cora watched from the hayloft ladder. May crouched beside her, one hand gripping the worn wood. Jesse had hidden himself deeper in the loft, his breathing too quick and shallow. 50 head, the auctioneer was saying. Prime stock. I can get $12 a head, maybe 13 if we time it right. 12 is fine, Vernon said. I need the sale completed by March 28th, 2 weeks from today. Silas stood in the barn doorway, his frame blocking the late afternoon light. You can't sell my cattle. Actually, Uncle, I can. The court order gives me authority to liquidate assets to cover your mounting debts. Vernon pulled a document from his coat pocket. Debts you've been hiding from the family. $1,200 owed to various creditors. The cattle sale will cover most of it. I don't owe anyone $1,200. The paperwork says otherwise. Vernon's smile was thin and sharp. Unless you're suggesting County Clerk Morrison falsified these records, that's a serious accusation, Uncle. Especially for a man whose competency is already under review. The auctioneer cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding before him. Mr. Huxley, I'll need the bills of sale drawn up by the 26th. That gives buyers time to arrange transport. Consider it done. Vernon folded the document and returned it to his pocket. My uncle's confusion about his finances is precisely why I petitioned for guardianship. He can't be trusted to manage his own affairs. Silas stepped into the barn. His boots struck the packed earth with deliberate weight. Those cattle represent 3 years of breeding. I built that herd from nothing. And I'm preserving what's left of your legacy before your poor judgment destroys it completely. Vernon's gaze lifted to the hayloft. Take those orphans, for instance. Feeding 3 extra mouths while you're drowning in debt. That's not charity, Uncle. That's delusion. Cora felt May's hand tighten on her arm. Get out, Silas said quietly. I'll leave when the auctioneer and I finish our business. The law's on my side, Uncle. You taught me that yourself. Respect the law, even when it's inconvenient. Vernon turned back to the auctioneer. March 28th, first light. I want every head sold by noon. The auctioneer nodded and headed for the barn door, tipping his hat to Silas as he passed. The gesture was apologetic, but final. Vernon paused beside his uncle. You could make this easier on everyone. Send the children back to the county. Acknowledge that you need family to help manage things. I'd even let you stay on the ranch in a limited capacity. Get out, Silas repeated. Vernon left, his footsteps fading across the yard. The sound of his wagon wheels followed, a slow grinding promise of return. Silas stood alone in the barn aisle for a long moment. Then his shoulders sagged, and Cora saw what she'd been dreading to see, an old man breaking under weight too heavy to carry. Jesse's whisper drifted down from the loft. If the cows go, we go too, right? No one answered him. The argument started after supper. Cora was washing dishes when Vernon's voice carried through the open window. He'd returned with more papers, more demands, more legal language that twisted like barbed wire. You're being unreasonable, Vernon was saying in the front room. The guardianship is for your own protection. I don't need protection from you. Silas's voice had gone tight. I need you to leave my home. Your home? Uncle, let's be honest about who's kept this place running. Those taxes you paid last year, I covered them. The fence repairs, my money. You've been living off my generosity for months. Lies. All lies. Are they? Check your bank records. Oh, wait, you can't because the court froze your accounts. Vernon's tone shifted, became almost gentle. I'm trying to help you. Why can't you see that? Because I can see your gambling debts. Silas's words came faster now, breath catching between them. Reverend Moss told me everything. You need this ranch to save yourself. Silence. The kind that precedes violence or revelation. Then Vernon's voice, cold and stripped of pretense. The Reverend has no proof, just gossip and speculation, but even if he did, it wouldn't matter. The judge has already accepted my guardianship petition. The will contest is already filed, and in 10 days, when you try to testify, everyone will see what I see, a confused old man who can't manage his own affairs. I'll tell them about Tom Dalton, about the wheel, about... Silas's words cut off, not naturally, but with a sharp intake of breath that Cora recognized instantly. She'd heard it before, when old Mrs. Chen had collapsed at the general store last winter, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Cora ran. May and Jesse followed, their feet pounding across the kitchen boards. They burst into the front room to find Silas crumpled beside his chair, one hand clutching his chest, his face gray as January snow. Papa Silas! Bah! May's scream brought Vernon around. For just a moment, Vernon's mask slipped. Cora saw genuine shock cross his face, maybe even concern. Then it was gone, replaced by calculation. Jesse, get Doc Brennan, Cora commanded. Run, fast. The boy flew out the door. Cora knelt beside Silas. His breathing was shallow, ragged. His eyes found hers, tried to focus. His lips moved, forming words that wouldn't come. Don't talk, Cora said. Her hands shook, but her voice stayed steady. Just breathe. The doctor's coming. Vernon stood above them, papers still clutched in one hand. He made no move to help, no gesture of comfort. He simply watched, and the wheels behind his eyes turned with terrible clarity. Doc Brennan arrived within 10 minutes, his medical bag swinging from one hand. He shouldered past Vernon without a word and examined Silas with practiced efficiency, checking pulse, listening to heart and lungs, asking questions Silas couldn't answer. Minor stroke, the doctor said finally. He needs rest. Complete rest. No stress, no arguments, no court hearings. Can he testify? Vernon asked. At the guardianship hearing? Doc Brennan's jaw tightened. Didn't you hear me? This man nearly died. Whether he testifies is the least of his concerns. Actually, doctor, it's very much a concern. The hearing is in 10 days. If Uncle Silas can't present his case, then his case doesn't get presented, the doctor snapped. I'm putting it in writing. Silas Garrett is medically unfit to appear in court for at least 30 days. Vernon's smile was small and satisfied. Of course, his health comes first. The doctor helped Silas into bed, giving Cora instructions about medications and warning signs. Then he left, shaking his head, his footsteps heavy with disapproval. Vernon lingered in the doorway. He looked at the 3 children gathered around Silas's bed, at the old man's gray face and labored breathing. When he spoke, his voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. The auction proceeds as scheduled, March 28th, first light. He paused. And I've contacted the county orphanage. They'll send a wagon Monday morning. Pack your things. May's hand found Cora's. Jessie pressed against her other side, trembling. Vernon left, his footsteps echoing through the house like a countdown. Silas's hand moved weakly across the quilt, reaching for Cora. She took it, felt how cold his fingers had become. His lips formed words, struggling. Fight, he whispered. Don't let him. We won't leave you, Cora said. Her voice didn't shake. Papa Silas were not leaving, but in the doorway she could see the covered wagon that would come Monday. Could hear the auctioneer's voice counting cattle. Could feel the weight of 10 days collapsing into something much smaller and more desperate. May's whisper cut through the darkness. Cora, what do we do? Cora looked at her sister, then at Jessie, then at the old man who'd offered them sanctuary and was now paying the price. We fight, she said. The barn loft smelled of dried hay and old wood and the particular quiet that comes after disaster. Cora sat cross-legged on a horse blanket, the lantern casting shadows that jumped with every gust of wind through the gaps in the walls. May huddled close on one side, Jessie on the other. Below them, the cattle moved restlessly in their stalls. 2 weeks until the auction, 3 days until the orphanage wagon. We could run, May said. Her voice was small, testing the idea like someone testing ice on a frozen pond. Back to the line shack. Hide until Vernon gives up. He won't give up, Cora said. He needs this ranch. Needs it bad enough to forge documents and bribe clerks. Running just means we lose and Papa Silas loses and Vernon gets everything. Jessie picked at a splinter in the floorboard. What if we brought the wheel to the judge, like Miss Esther said? Show him Daddy's mark. Cora had been thinking about that wheel hub for 2 days straight. Thinking about how her father's hands had shaped the iron, how his stamp had marked it permanent as a brand on cattle. Proof that couldn't be argued away with legal words or typed documents. The hearing's in 7 days, she said slowly. But Papa Silas can't testify. Doc Brennan put it in writing. Without him telling the story about Daddy saving his life, the wheel's just a wheel. What if we testify? May asked. Children can't testify in property disputes. Judge Hayes told Papa Silas that last month when the widow Crawford tried to bring her granddaughter to court. Cora's hands curled into fists. The law says we're too young to understand what we're saying. The unfairness of it burned in her chest, hot and helpless and familiar. She'd felt it when the county said she was too young to claim her father's shop, felt it when Mrs. Pruitt pulled her daughter away on the church steps, felt it every time an adult decided her words didn't matter because she was 11 years old and small. Then what do we do? Jessie's voice cracked. Cora looked at her siblings, May with her fierce eyes and stubborn chin, Jessie with his too quick breathing and hands that used to carve toy horses but hadn't touched wood since their father died. They were depending on her, had been depending on her since the fire, since the county office, since every adult who should have helped them turned away instead. We bring the wheel hub to court anyway, Cora said, and we make sure everyone knows what it means. How? Miss Esther can testify about Daddy's mark, Reverend Moss can testify about Vernon's debts, and maybe, she paused, an idea forming, maybe Papa Silas doesn't have to speak. Maybe he just has to be there, to nod yes or no when people ask him questions. May sat up straighter. Doc Brennan said he couldn't testify, didn't say he couldn't attend. Exactly. Cora's mind raced ahead, seeing the pieces like her father used to see how metal would fold and shape under his hammer. If Papa Silas is there, if he's sitting beside us, people will remember he chose us. Vernon can wave all the papers he wants, but they'll see an old man who wanted children in his house and a nephew who wanted money in his pocket. Jesse's breathing had slowed. You think it'll work? I think, Cora said carefully, it's the only chance we've got. Marshal Ben Cord's office smelled of coffee grounds and gun oil and the leather of saddles waiting to be mended. The morning sun slanted through the window, catching dust motes that drifted like snow that had forgotten how to fall. Reverend Moss sat in the chair opposite the marshal's desk, his lined face grave. Cora stood beside him, having insisted on coming despite the Reverend's protests that this was adult business. The marshal was 50, with iron-gray hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than in offices. He listened while Reverend Moss laid out the evidence, the ledger showing Vernon's debts, the pattern of bribes to County Clerk Morrison, the forged documents that had been filed under Silas's name. When the Reverend finished, Marshal Cord sat back in his chair. It creaked under his weight. That's a serious accusation, he said. Fraud, forgery, bribery of a county official. I have documentation. Reverend Moss pushed the ledger across the desk. Dates, amounts, Morrison's signature on receipts he thought no one would ever see. The marshal opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the entries. His jaw tightened with each page turned. Where'd you get this? Morrison's kept woman. She came to confession last week, wanted absolution for her part in it, said Morrison kept records of every transaction in case Vernon tried to cheat him out of his cut. She willing to testify? She's willing to disappear to Denver and never come back, but she gave me this, and she swore it's accurate. Marshal Cord closed the ledger. This'll stand up in court, maybe. Morrison could claim it's fabricated, that you altered the entries. Which is why we need him arrested, before he has time to run or destroy evidence, Reverend Moss said. Vernon knows the hearing's coming. If Morrison gets spooked, he'll burn every document that ties him to this scheme. The marshal stood, reaching for his coat on the peg by the door. All right, I'll bring Morrison in for questioning, but Reverend, this opens a nest of snakes. Vernon Huxley's got friends. The judge will want everything airtight before he throws out that second will. We have more than the ledger, Cora said. Both men turned to look at her. She straightened her shoulders. My father's mark is on the wagon wheel I fixed. Miss Esther Tompkins can testify to that. It proves we're Tom Dalton's children, which proves we're not con artists. The marshal's expression softened slightly. That'll help. But child, you understand what you're up against. Vernon's lawyers will tear into anyone who testifies. They'll make Miss Esther look like a sentimental fool, and the Reverend look like a meddling gossip. And you... He paused. They'll say you coached your siblings, planted false memories, made up stories to trick an old man. Let them say it, Cora said. Her voice was steady. Let them say whatever they want. The wheel doesn't lie. Daddy's mark is burned into the iron, and no lawyer can argue that away. Marshal Cord studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, just a little, just enough to show he heard her. You got sand, girl. I'll give you that. He settled his hat on his head. I'll arrest Morrison this afternoon. Keep it quiet until the hearing. No sense warning Vernon before we have to. What about the cattle auction? Cora asked. Vernon's planning to sell them in 11 days. Can't stop a court-ordered sale without new evidence that invalidates the order. But if Morrison confesses, if the judge sees those debts are fabricated, the whole house of cards comes down. Vernon loses his authority, the auction gets canceled, and you children stay right where you are. And if Morrison doesn't confess? Reverend Moss asked quietly. The marshal's expression hardened. Then we fight it out in court with what we've got, and pray the judge has enough sense to see through Vernon's lies. He opened the door, then paused. One more thing. Vernon's wife, Clara, she came by yesterday asking questions about divorce proceedings, wanted to know if a wife could testify against her husband in a fraud case. Cora's breath caught. What did you tell her? Told her the law's complicated, but I also told her that sometimes doing the right thing costs more than staying quiet. Marshal Cord's eyes met Cora's. Maybe you should pay Mrs. Huxley a visit, woman to woman. Sometimes the best evidence comes from the people closest to the crime. The general store smelled of pickles and penny candy and the particular shame of public accusation. Cora stood in the aisle between the flour barrels and the fabric bolts, May and Jessie flanking her like soldiers who'd forgotten how to retreat. Vernon Huxley held up a silver pocket watch, letting it catch the afternoon light streaming through the window. The chain dangled from his fingers like a noose waiting to drop. This, Vernon announced to the half-dozen customers browsing the store, belonged to my uncle, a family heirloom passed down from his father, and this morning I found it hidden in the children's room. Mrs. Pruitt gasped from behind the counter. Two ranch wives whispered to each other near the doorway. Old Pete Garrison, examining nails by weight, went very still. Cora felt the familiar burn of injustice in her throat. We didn't take anything. Really? Vernon's smile was all concern and manufactured sadness. Then how did it end up in your dresser drawer, hidden under your spare dress? Because you put it there, May said, her voice shaking with rage. That's a serious accusation, young lady. Are you calling me a liar? Vernon turned to Mrs. Pruitt. Would you be willing to search them? Make sure they haven't taken anything else? The store owner looked uncomfortable, caught between community duty and growing suspicion. Mr. Huxley, I don't think... Please, Vernon said. I'm not accusing them of malice. Children sometimes take things without understanding, but my uncle's property needs to be protected, especially given his condition. Cora met his eyes and saw the trap clearly. Refuse the search and look guilty, submit and be humiliated either way. Vernon was counting on her pride, on the anger that would make her fight back and prove his point about ungrateful orphans causing trouble. She turned out her pockets, empty except for a nail and a piece of string. May did the same. Jesse followed, his hands trembling. Mrs. Pruitt conducted the search with apologetic efficiency, checking coat linings, feeling through the folds of May's dress, examining Jesse's boots. She found nothing. Her expression shifted from uncertainty to something harder as she straightened up. They're clean, Mrs. Pruitt said. She looked at Vernon with new eyes. Not so much as a spare penny. Vernon's smile didn't waver. Well, perhaps I was mistaken about where I found the watch. He tucked it back into his vest pocket. My apologies for the confusion. These are stressful times. But before he could continue his performance, something clattered to the floor. The pocket watch. It had fallen from Vernon's own coat, from a tear in the lining that everyone could now see. The watch rolled across the wooden planks and came to rest against Cora's boot. The silence that followed was thick as creek mud. Mrs. Pruitt's face went red. You planted it. I did no such thing. The watch must have fallen through. A hole that size doesn't appear overnight. Her voice carried across the store like the brass bell that announced customers. You'd frame children to make yourself look responsible? Old Pete Garrison set down his nails. That's low, Huxley, even for someone chasing an inheritance. Vernon's face flushed. You're all being manipulated. Can't you see? These orphans have turned my uncle against his own family, and now they're turning the town. I'll be at that hearing, Mrs. Pruitt interrupted. And I'm bringing friends. Judge Hayes needs to hear about this little performance. Vernon looked around the store at the shifting expressions, suspicion replaced by disgust. Uncertainty hardened into judgment. He drew himself up, smoothed his coat, and managed to resurrect his smile. Believe what you will. The law will determine the truth. He walked to the door, each step measured and deliberate. Good day. The door closed behind him. The brass bell rang like an accusation. Mrs. Pruitt came around the counter and knelt in front of May. I'm sorry for pulling my daughter away from you at church, for believing him. She looked up at Cora. Whatever you need between now and that hearing, you come to me. Understood? Cora nodded, not trusting her voice. The jail cell smelled of damp stone and regret. Clara Huxley sat on the narrow bench, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for church to start. She wore a plain gray dress, her hair pulled back severe from her face. Without Vernon's expensive clothes and polished veneer, she looked smaller, tired. Marshall Cord had brought Cora back alone, leaving May and Jesse with Reverend Moss. Sometimes, the marshal had said, one honest voice is worth more than a crowd of righteousness. Clara looked up as Cora approached the cell bars. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, past tears, into the country beyond them. I left bread, Clara said. On your doorstep, 3 times. I was too frightened to do more. Cora remembered finding those cloth-wrapped packages in the early mornings, still warm. She'd thought they were from Esther, or maybe the Reverend. Why were you frightened? Because I knew what Vernon was doing, the forgery, the bribes, the gambling debts that started this whole nightmare. Clara's hands clenched and unclenched in her lap. I married him, thinking he was honorable. Took me 6 years to see the truth. By then, I was complicit. Every lie I didn't challenge. Every document I saw him type late at night. Every time I stayed silent. Martial Court says you want to testify. Want is the wrong word. Need. I need to testify. Not for redemption. I don't deserve that. But because 3 children shouldn't pay for my cowardice. Clara stood, moved to the bars. Up close, Cora could see the fine lines around her eyes, the gray threading through her brown hair. Vernon used my typewriter for the second will. I have the ribbon carbon. It shows every letter typed. The entire document, word for word. Cora's heart kicked against her ribs. That's proof. It's evidence. Not quite proof. Vernon could claim I typed it at his dictation that Silas was present and lucid. But combined with everything else? Clara's smile was bitter. It destroys his credibility, shows he's capable of forgery, makes the judge question every document Vernon's presented. Why tell me? Why not just bring it to the marshal? Because I wanted you to hear it from me first. Wanted you to know that not every adult failed you. Clara's voice cracked. I'm leaving Vernon, filing for divorce, moving to Kansas where I have a sister. After the hearing, you'll never see me again, but I needed you to know I saw you. I saw what Vernon was doing, and I'm sorry I didn't find my courage sooner. For a long moment, Cora said nothing. Then, thank you. Clara reached through the bars, her hand extended. Cora hesitated, then took it. When, Clara whispered, for all of us who stayed silent too long. The ranch porch smelled of pine and coming rain, and the particular quiet that settles before confessions. Silas sat in his rocking chair wrapped in quilts despite the warming weather, his face still gray but his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. His words came slowly, shaped carefully around the weakness the stroke had left behind. Cora sat on the steps below him, May and Jessie on either side. The late March wind carried the scent of thawing earth and something else, spring, maybe, or just the promise of it. Should have changed the will years ago, Silas said. His voice was rough, each word an effort. When Vernon started gambling, when he started borrowing against the ranch without asking, should have cut him out then. You couldn't have known he'd do this, Cora said. Could have. Should have. Silas's hands trembled on the quilt. But he was blood. My sister's only boy. I kept thinking he'd straighten out, kept giving him chance because that's what family does. He paused, breathing hard. And while I was being loyal to blood, I was failing you 3. The children who actually needed me. May's hand found his. You didn't fail us, Papa Silas. Nearly did. Would have if you hadn't fixed that wheel, if Tom Dalton's daughter hadn't been smart enough and strong enough to save a foolish old man. Silas's eyes found Cora's. Tom saved my life in '67. Blizzard hit while I was hauling supplies. Horse threw me, broke my leg. Would have frozen if your daddy hadn't found me and pulled me into his shop. He never told us that story, Cora said quietly. He wouldn't have. Tom wasn't the bragging kind. Just did what needed doing, same as you. Silas reached inside his quilts and pulled out a bundle of letters tied with string. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. Your daddy wrote these, 3 letters over 10 years. Told me about getting married, about you being born, Cora, about May and Jessie coming along, about building his shop into something he could pass down. Cora took the letters with careful hands. The paper felt fragile, like it might crumble at rough handling. She could see her father's handwriting, neat and precise, the hand of someone who worked with measurements and angles. Last letter came 6 months before the fire, Silas continued. Tom said he'd been thinking about mortality, about what happens to children if their parents die unexpected. Asked if I'd be willing to look after you 3, should anything happen. Silas's voice broke. I wrote back saying, of course, that any child of Tom Dalton's would be welcome on my ranch, blood relation or not. May made a small sound. Half sob, half laugh. We have family. Real family. You always did. Just took me too long to make it official. Silas wiped his eyes with shaking hands. I kept delaying the adoption papers, telling myself there was time, telling myself I should try to reconcile with Vernon first, not cut him out completely. And while I was hesitating, he was scheming. You chose us when it mattered, Cora said. She touched the letters like they were something sacred. That's what counts. Hope the judge sees it that way. Hope. Silas trailed off, looking out at the ranch, the barn where Vernon had scheduled the auction, the corrals holding cattle marked for sale, the land that had been his life's work. This place should have gone to my son. He died at Antietam, 23 years old. After that, I thought it should go to Vernon. Blood claim, family legacy. He looked at the 3 children. Took me too long to understand that family isn't just blood. It's who you'd walk through a blizzard for. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and sharp. Hearings in 4 days, Silas said. Doc says I can't testify proper, can't string words together long enough to make sense. But I can sit beside you, can nod yes or no, can let the judge see that my mind's clear enough to know who I want. We'll make it work, Cora said. She folded the letters carefully and tucked them inside her coat. These letters prove Daddy knew you, prove you owed him, prove we're not con artists. 4 days, Jesse whispered. Feels like forever. 4 days, Silas agreed. Then we find out if truth matters more than paperwork. The church basement smelled of damp stone and candle wax and the collective determination of people who'd decided to care. Esther Tompkins stood at the workbench with the wagon wheel hub before her like an altarpiece. The lamplight caught the iron surface, throwing shadows that made the stamped maker's mark look deeper than it was. TD Sunburst, clear as gospel. Reverend Moss coached townspeople in careful, measured tones, teaching them how to answer questions under oath, how to avoid being trapped by clever lawyers. Marshal Cord reviewed his arrest warrant for County Clerk Morrison, checking dates and signatures with the thoroughness of someone who knew Vernon's lawyers would challenge every detail. Mrs. Pruitt organized courtroom seating, making lists of who'd agreed to attend and where they'd sit for maximum effect. We'll fill every bench, she was saying. Vernon walks in, he sees 50 people who know he's lying. Cora sat at a small table in the corner with May and Jesse, practicing their testimony even though children couldn't officially speak in property court. If the judge asks you anything, she told them, answer simple, yes or no, don't add stories, don't try to explain, just truth, plain as you can say it. May nodded, serious. Jesse practiced speaking without his voice shaking. Esther lifted the wheel hub, turning it in the lamplight. This is good work, she said to no one in particular. Tom's best. The hub's perfectly balanced, no wobble. Marks stamped deep enough to last 100 years. She looked at Cora. Your daddy made things to endure. That's what this mark means, quality that outlasts the maker. Will it be enough? Cora asked. In court? Esther set the hub down gently. Truth's always enough, child. Question is whether people are brave enough to see it. Outside, the rain fell harder. Inside, the sound of it on the tin roof was like 1,000 small drums, beating time toward Tuesday morning. The courtroom smelled of beeswax and old wood, and the sweat of 50 people packed into benches meant for 30. Morning light slanted through the tall windows, catching dust motes that hung suspended like the breath everyone was holding. Judge Hayes sat behind his bench, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression unreadable as carved granite. Cora sat in the front row between May and Jesse, Silas beside them in a chair the bailiff had brought specially. The old man's hands trembled on the armrests, but his eyes were clear and fixed on the judge with fierce determination. Vernon sat across the aisle with 2 lawyers in expensive suits. He'd but dressed carefully, dark coat, pressed shirt, the picture of respectable family concern. But Cora could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed against his knee. Behind them, the townspeople filled every available space. Mrs. Pruitt, in the second row, flanked by her daughter and 3 other shopkeepers. Old Pete Garrison, leaning against the back wall, ranch wives who'd brought their husbands, Doc Brennan, arms crossed, face stern, and in the very back, almost hidden, Clara Huxley in her plain gray dress. Mr. Huxley, Judge Hayes said, you've petitioned for guardianship of your uncle, based on claims of diminished capacity and financial mismanagement. You've also contested his will, producing what you claim is a newer, valid document. Is that correct? Vernon stood. Yes, Your Honor. It pains me to take these actions, but family duty requires— Save the speeches, the judge interrupted. I've read your filings. Now I'll hear from those who have evidence to present. Marshal Cord, you requested to speak first. The marshal stood, pulling County Clerk Morrison to his feet by the arm. The clerk looked like he'd aged 10 years in 3 days, his face sallow, his eyes darting between Vernon and the door like a trapped animal calculating escape. Your Honor, 3 days ago, I arrested Morrison on charges of forgery and accepting bribes. Under questioning, he confessed to filing false debt documents in Silas Garrett's name at Vernon Huxley's request. The debts listed in Mr. Huxley's guardianship petition don't exist. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Vernon shot to his feet. That's absurd. Morrison's obviously been coerced. Sit down, Mr. Huxley. Judge Hayes's voice could have frozen water in July. He turned to Morrison. You confess to this? Morrison's voice was barely audible. Yes, sir. Speak up. Yes, sir. Vernon paid me 10% to file documents showing Silas owed $1,200 to various creditors. The debts were fabricated, all of them. Vernon's lawyer stood. Your Honor, this testimony is clearly the result of pressure from... I said sit down. The judge removed his glasses, cleaning them with slow deliberation. Continue, Marshal. Morrison also confirmed that he witnessed Vernon's second will under false pretenses. Vernon told him Silas had approved the document when in fact Silas had never seen it. The will is a forgery. Esther Tompkins rose from the third row, carrying the wagon wheel hub with both hands. She walked to the front of the courtroom and set it on the evidence table with a hollow thunk that echoed like a heartbeat. If I may, Your Honor, she said, I have something the court needs to see. Judge Hayes gestured for her to continue. Esther produced a magnifying glass from her apron pocket. This wheel hub was repaired by Cora Dalton 6 weeks ago when Silas Garrett's wagon broke down. The repair work shows professional blacksmith skill, but more important, she held the glass over the hub's surface. There's a maker's mark stamped into the iron, TD Sunburst. That mark belonged to Thomas Dalton, the finest blacksmith in 3 territories. He stamped it into every piece he made as proof of quality and origin. She looked at Cora. Thomas Dalton was these children's father. This mark proves their lineage. It proves they're not con artists or opportunists. They're the children of a man who saved Silas Garrett's life in 1867. Vernon's lawyer stood again. Your Honor, a mark proves nothing without corroborating. I have corroboration, Reverend Moss said, rising from his seat. He held up the bundle of letters. Thomas Dalton wrote these to Silas Garrett over 10 years. They document his marriage, the births of his children, and his final request, that Silas look after Cora, May, and Jesse should anything happen to him. The last letter is dated 6 months before Tom died, in a shop fire. Judge Hayes took the letters, reading them with painstaking care. The courtroom waited in silence, broken only by the creak of floorboards as people shifted weight from foot to foot. Finally, the judge looked up. Mr. Garrett, can you confirm that Thomas Dalton saved your life? Silas nodded, his whole body putting weight behind the gesture. And did you agree to care for his children? Another nod, fiercer this time. Did you willingly invite these children into your home? Silas's hand found Cora's. He held it up for the whole courtroom to see, his fingers wrapped around hers like a vow. He nodded again. Your Honor, Vernon's lawyer tried one more time. My client has every legal right. Your client, Judge Hayes said, has committed fraud, bribery, and attempted theft through legal manipulation. I'm invalidating the so-called second will. I'm dismissing the guardianship petition. And I'm ordering an investigation into every document Vernon Huxley has filed with this court in the past 5 years. Vernon's face drained of color. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm approving immediate adoption proceedings for Cora, May, and Jesse Dalton to become legal children of Silas Garrett. The auction scheduled for this Friday is canceled. All assets are returned to Mr. Garrett's sole control. He brought his gavel down once, sharp and final as a door slamming shut. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Mrs. Pruitt cheered. Old Pete Garrison clapped. May burst into tears and threw her arms around Silas, who held her with shaking hands and eyes streaming. Jesse looked up at Cora. We won? We won, Cora said. Through the noise and celebration, she watched Vernon being led from the courtroom by Marshal Cord. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. Clara met his eyes once as he passed, then looked away. At the evidence table, the wagon wheel hub caught the morning light. The TD Sunburst mark gleamed like a promise kept across years and death and fire. The courthouse steps smelled of spring rain and worn stone, and the particular relief that comes after long holding of breath. Vernon Huxley stood between Marshal Cord and a deputy, his hands bound with iron cuffs that caught the afternoon light. His expensive coat was rumpled now, his carefully maintained dignity stripped away like paint from old wood. The crowd that had filled the courtroom spilled onto the steps and yard, but they didn't jeer or celebrate. They simply watched, silent witnesses to consequence playing itself out in the open air where everyone could see. Mrs. Pruitt approached Cora as Marshal Cord loaded Vernon into the wagon. I'm sorry, the shopkeeper said quietly, for doubting you, For pulling Mary away? For believing him over you? It's all right, Cora said, though it wasn't. Not entirely. Some wounds needed time to close properly. Doc Brennan shook Silas's hand, holding it longer than necessary. You're a good man, Silas. Always have been. Silas nodded, still not trusting his voice to carry full sentences. His free hand rested on Jesse's shoulder like an anchor. Clara Huxley emerged from the courthouse last, carrying a small carpet bag that held everything she'd decided was worth keeping. She paused at the bottom step, looking at Vernon in the wagon. He stared straight ahead, refusing to meet her eyes. She turned to Cora instead. I'm catching the afternoon stage to Cheyenne. From there, Kansas. She paused. I don't expect forgiveness. Just wanted you to know, doing the right thing doesn't erase doing the wrong thing for so long, but it's still worth doing. Cora nodded. Clara walked away toward the stage depot, her back straight, carrying her small bag like it weighed nothing at all. The marshal's wagon rolled down Main Street, Vernon sitting silent in the back. As it passed, old Pete Garrison removed his hat. Not in respect, in acknowledgement that pride, when left unchecked, eventually finds its bill. Silas touched Cora's elbow. When she looked at him, he pointed toward the ranch road, then made a gesture like wrapping arms around something. Home. Time to go home. The spring air smelled of new grass and warm soil, and the smoke from branding fires. 6 weeks had passed since the courthouse, and the land had transformed from brown to green like someone had painted it overnight. Meadowlarks called from fence posts, their songs bright as the morning sun. The new wagon wheel stood propped against the barn wall, its spokes still smelling of fresh varnish. Cora had painted their names around the rim in careful letters: Cora, May, Jesse, encircling the TD sunburst mark at the center like petals around a flower. In the spring pasture, townspeople gathered for the branding ceremony that doubled as celebration. Tables groaned under food brought by families who'd decided to show up mattered more than words. Esther Tompkins turned meat on the grill while Reverend Moss blessed the gathering with a prayer about second chances and chosen family. Jesse held the branding iron with both hands, his face serious with concentration. Silas guided his grip, showing him the proper angle. The calf balled once when the iron touched, then settled as Jesse pulled away cleanly. The Garrett mark, a simple G with a crossed line, stood clear on the calf's hide. Jesse's first brand, his first mark of belonging. The crowd applauded. May hugged her brother, and even Silas's eyes were damp. Later, as the sun dropped toward the western peaks and the gathering moved to supper, Silas pulled the adoption papers from his coat pocket. The ink was barely dry, the county seal still fresh. He read them aloud in his halting voice, each word an effort but worth the making. Cora, May, and Jesse Garrett, my children, by law and love, heirs to this ranch and everything I have to give. He paused, catching his breath. Which ain't much besides land and cattle and a house that needs repair, but it's yours, all of it, forever. May threw her arms around him. Jesse pressed close to his other side. Cora stood slightly apart, her hand touching the wagon wheel where it leaned against the barn. The sun caught the painted names, making them glow. Beneath them, the TD sunburst mark, her father's signature, his promise that quality endures beyond the maker's years. She touched it gently, her fingers tracing the grooves worn smooth by her father's hands 2 decades gone. We made it home, Daddy, she whispered. The wheel caught the dying light and held it. Somewhere in the pasture, cattle lowed. The meadowlarks sang again, and around the tables, people who doubted and then believed passed food and stories and the understanding that family wasn't always the people you were born to. Sometimes it was the people who chose you when the world said you weren't worth choosing. The wheel turned slightly in the wind, rolling an inch forward before settling. Ready for the next journey, reckon some wheels break so the right hands can fix them. Vernon Huxley learned what a lot of men learned too late, that blood don't make family. Choice does. He spent 18 months working the railroad, loading ties and hammering spikes for wages that barely covered room and board. Last I heard, he'd moved to Denver, sobered up, found honest work. Maybe that's justice too, giving a man enough rope to either hang himself or climb out of the hole he dug. That ranch still stands today, 4th-generation Garretts working it, all descended from 3 orphans who had nothing but their daddy's tools and enough grit to use them. Cora married a railroad engineer, raised 5 children who knew how to work metal and mend broken things. May became a teacher, taught 200 students to read before she retired. Jesse took over the ranch when Silas passed, ran it for 40 years before his own children took the reins. Silas lived another 12 years after that courthouse day, never missed a Sunday dinner, never stopped telling folks how Tom Dalton saved him twice, once in a blizzard, once through his children. Last time I rode past that place, the wheel was still there, mounted on the barn wall like a compass pointing toward what matters. Names painted bright: Cora, May, Jesse, and in the center, that sunburst mark, TD quality that endures. Spring mud on my boots, meadowlarks calling from fence posts, cattle grazing where 3 scared children once wondered if they'd see another sunrise. The mark's still visible after all these years, still clear, still true, because dust won't settle on a lie, friend. But it rests easy on truth well earned, and sometimes when the light hits that wheel just right, you can almost hear the sound of small hands working cold iron, fixing what was broken, claiming what was always meant to be theirs, home.